Without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our first panel of the day on equity-driven policy and practice. Our moderator is Nathaniel Smith, the founder and chief equity officer of the Partnership for Southern Equity. Nathaniel's work advances policies and institutional actions that promote racial equity across sectors like health, the economy, and climate. Our first panelist is Amy Liu, Vice President and Director of the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings and the Adeline M. and Alfred I. Johnson Chair in Urban and Metropolitan Policy. Amy has extensive experience working directly on economic growth and opportunity strategies with scores of public, private, and philanthropic sector leaders across the country. Our second panelist is Julie Nelson, Founding Director of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, Senior Vice President at Race Forward, and a Senior Fellow with the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at the University of California, Berkeley. She's also the former Director of the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, where she provided both vision and hands-on work to Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative. Our final panelist is Christy Slater, a Program Officer for the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, where she develops programming priorities, manages and monitors a portfolio of active grants, and designs and implements national grant initiatives, place-based work, and multi-year projects that affect systematic change in program strategy with an emphasis on New Orleans. And with that, I will pass it to Nathaniel to kick off the conversation.
Thank you, Amanda, so much for giving me this opportunity to facilitate this conversation and also to be amongst friends and co-laborers in the equity movement, both new friends and old friends, working to move this agenda forward, both regionally and nationally. I also want to take the time to honor and congratulate the UNUM fellows, individuals that have been selected to participate as a fellow. I am certain that you will learn a great deal that you will be able to leverage as you also become a co-laborer in this work for racial equity in your respective jurisdictions. We have a brief amount of time, so I want to jump in. And again, you know, this is a conversation amongst colleagues and allies. And so we're going to try our best to make this, how can I say this, not as stuffy as some panels may be. This is about real talk, like we say in the South. And so you have a great set of panelists that will help us move forward in doing that. So let me first start with Amy and the great work that she is doing at Brookings in the Metropolitan Policy Program. Amy, can you just talk a little bit about the program and specifically, you know, your work around engaging local governments to support inclusive growth? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, Nathaniel, and hello everyone, and congratulations to all of you for being part of the Fellows Program, and hats off to our good friend, Mayor Mitch Landrieu, for really getting this program off the ground. It's really critical and so timely right now. Many of you may not be familiar with the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. I think most of you think of Brookings as a think tank. We certainly produce a lot of data for every single part of the country, but what excites me and our team the most is our partnerships and collaborations with leaders around the country. Our mission basically is to empower people like you to create growth, prosperity, and inclusion in their communities, closing disparities by race and by place. And we generate data on what inclusive growth looks like for all communities that are larger than 250,000 populations. And the way we work is we can do everything from partnering with many of you on having you understand what the common trends and narrative is, because what we have learned in working with people, especially cross-sector, is that people need to have a common language. They need to have a common framework or a common understanding of the challenges in order to find a way forward. And so our data and our framework does that. And then sometimes we work even more directly in partnership with cross-sector leaders to advance an inclusive economic growth agenda. And in the South, we've done that. In places like Memphis, we've been in a long time collaboration with Mayor Woodfin in Birmingham.
Thank you, Amy. Christy, can you give us, you know, your perspective? Of course, you bring so much value to this panel in terms of your leadership in philanthropy by way of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Can you talk a little bit about your work in the South and even more specifically, what do you see your role see the role of philanthropy in supporting equity-driven work?
Absolutely. So thank you. First, I want to thank the E Pluribus Unum team for inviting me to join this engaging panel. Also, like everybody else, want to say congratulations to the fellows for embarking on this leadership journey, is the word I'm trying to say. And I would just encourage you all to become comfortable with being uncomfortable if you truly want to grow from this experience. As anyone who's ever tried to embark on a new exercise program knows, that change doesn't happen when we're comfortable. So I wanted to say a quick word about the Kellogg Foundation. Guided by the belief that all children have an equal opportunity to thrive, WKKF works with communities to create conditions for vulnerable children so they can realize their full potential in school, work, and life. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of background to understand who we are and kind of the framework we're coming from. For the work that I do in New Orleans, our vision is for New Orleans to become a child-centered city. And so that means that all people, programs, and policies are creating conditions for children and families to thrive. We know that work doesn't happen in isolation, that children live in families and those families live in communities. So we look at how to best support children so they can thrive and become their best selves. And that means that their parents need to be in high quality jobs and live in communities where they're nurtured. So our grant making supports thriving children, working families, and equitable communities. And this means investing in early childhood education, health equity, maternal and child health, access to healthy food, workforce development, enterprise development, and asset development, all through a lens of what we consider our DNA, which is racial equity and healing, community engagement, and leadership development. So I'll try to say all of that 5 times fast. We know that communities have the leadership, the knowledge, and the resolve to build and sustain equitable communities where all children can thrive. So our approach and what I believe philanthropy's role is to be a catalytic partner in that process. Philanthropy has the ability to invest in innovation, to test pilot projects with the goal of scaling for larger impacts. It also has the ability to leverage its connections, its networks, and knowledge to bring stakeholders together to address community needs and create solutions together. Nate, can I just give an example?
Please, please.
Okay. All right, so I want to actually, since this group is really working across the South, which is very exciting, I want to give an example of some of our work from Jackson, Mississippi. And so this example is about Jackson Public Schools. So in 2017, Jackson Public Schools was on the brink of being taken over by the state. JPS is the second largest school district in Mississippi and serves about 24,000 students. At that time, then Governor Phil Bryant was in favor of the takeover. Jackson Mayor Chokwe Lumumba wanted to maintain local control, and the community had filed a federal lawsuit to halt the process because they claimed the state violated the constitutional rights of students and parents by locking them out of the decision-making process. So just imagine the tension in the community at that time among students, parents, educators, and political leaders. Everyone, thankfully, wanted the same thing for children, meaning a high-quality education experience, but they all had very different ideas on how to get there, given political ideologies, the tension caused by the urgency of the situation, and the belief that their way was the only path forward. So our role as the Kellogg Foundation, we were able to step in and bring both sides to the table to imagine a third option, which resulted in creating the Better Together Commission. So the Better Together Commission was comprised of a variety of key stakeholders. So it was educators, parents, students, business leaders, and government officials to all work together to chart a path forward for Jackson Public Schools. So where are we now? So here we are 3 years later, and we are on a path towards what JPS calls equitable and excellent education for all students in Jackson Public Schools. So this is just the beginning of the work. There's much more to do, but I feel like philanthropy has a role in helping to catalyze these partnerships and being a thought partner in the process that's going to ultimately lead to an equitable change.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you for sharing that great example. Julie, what can I say about the work of GARE, the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, and the great work that you've done engaging governments around the country and really helping them to provide real technical assistance and support around doing the work of racial equity and not just talking about it. Can you talk a little bit about your work and how about, your work around engaging local communities and governments that are looking to embed equity into their daily practices and culture?
Yes, I would love to talk about that. Thank you. And also thanks for the invitation to be here. It's congratulations to the fellows, really looking at this as an exciting opportunity, not just in the South, but for us across the country. So the Government Alliance on Race and Equity is a membership network. It is local government that have made a commitment to advancing racial justice. In the intros, it was referenced that I'm the former director of the Seattle Office for Civil Rights. And the city of Seattle was the first jurisdiction in the country to launch an effort that was really aimed at eliminating institutional and structural racism. That was about 15 years ago, actually over 15 years ago. I lose track of time. But what we have seen over the course of the past decades is that at the local government level, we're seeing more and more jurisdictions that are making that commitment, that are recognizing that we need to have as a fundamental way of operating a focus on racial equity. And so we're a peer-to-peer, membership-led, membership-driven network launched about 6 years ago. And what's really exciting to share is that every single year we have doubled in size. And so what started out as a lot of work going on in the Northwest, but spreading across the country, we now have 300 members across every single part of the country that are working to advance racial justice. So how we go about doing that? We have a model that talks about normalizing, operationalizing, organizing, and creating values, having a values-based approach. From a normalizing perspective, so frequently when it comes to talking about race, many people will think about it from a perspective of enforcement of anti-discrimination law or keeping bad people from doing bad things. We really focus on systemic racism. So looking at the ways in which institutions and structures perpetuate racial inequities. We're just having that set of definitions or a shared analysis isn't enough. And we have probably all seen lots of organizations that send people to training, people go to training and then go back to their jobs and just keep doing their jobs the exact same way. It's why we really focus on operationalizing and organizing. So from an operationalizing perspective, what that means is that on a day in, day out basis, we need to bake an analysis of systemic racism into our decision making, analyzing who's benefiting and who's burdened by given decisions. We have a racial equity tool that we use from a methodology perspective, and really looking at that, not just as like, oh, does the jurisdiction have a chief equity officer? That's their responsibility, but looking across the breadth and depth of the organization. That kind of leads me to organizing. We talk about organizing from an inside-outside perspective. And so within a city, a county, or a state, that we need to have employees who have the skills, the capacities, the tools, the expertise to make different decisions, to change policies, to change practices. We do that via organizing, and our organizing is best, it's strongest when we are doing it in partnership with community. We know that people sort of inside the organization have their areas of expertise, but as it was said previously, we know people in community are the ones who have the expertise around solutions. So inside outside organizing is absolutely critical. I will pause there. You get me started talking about
it's okay. No, it's fine.
I can go on longer.
It's fine. No, it's fine. And that is where I want to go. And again, I mean, this is a real talk conversation. And because of that, I think what you've lifted up is so important in terms of the ingredients. You know, I want to go a little bit deeper in this discussion. You know, we're in a very entrenched and challenging time right now after the previous administration really elevating in a lot of ways different perspectives on who deserves what, how should opportunity be structured, and even more important, who should have a say, right, in our body politic and in our democracy. You know, and in the work, and we're all practitioners, I mean, in the work of advancing racial equity, there's a planning side and there's a policy side, but then there's a political side. There's a political side to advancing racial equity. And I believe that all three of you represent three key pillars in breaking through the politics of marginalization. Where do you see your particular areas? In particular, you know, you think about the work of Brookings and of course the world of philanthropy and also a racial equity organization like GARE, of course, Race Forward. Where do you see the role of your particular areas and in your particular organizations in helping to break through the political barriers that sometimes show up as it relates to advancing racial equity?
I'll go ahead and start there on this one. And so I think about the fact that politics of the South is complicated, and everyone here who's a fellow knows it better than I. And what I have learned is private sector matters in advancing an agenda on racial equity and competitiveness locally and with the state legislature. And what's interesting is this is the vantage point in which Brookings plays into a lot of these conversations. And I think there's multiple pathways to advancing this agenda. We are often invited by mayors because we are in the middle, because of the need to create an inclusive economic agenda. And we're now in a pandemic. We are now in a recession. And every elected official has to put together an economic recovery plan. We have thousands of people unemployed. We need a different kind of hiring. We know employers are talking about talent. We know that we have to focus on a small business recovery. We know capital matters. And we need the private sector engaged in the solution to racial equity. And I have personally, in my own expertise, have been very direct about the fact that the economic power base has been part of the problem. And if we're going to be candid here, right, if they are the ones who set the establishment, the business leaders, the CEOs, they set the economic agenda for a community. They are employers in the community. They set the terms for where investment goes, and they set the table oftentimes for these civic conversations. And so it's really incumbent, I think, for my role at Brookings is to get the establishment to change. And what I really love about the partnership with mayors, and particularly the new crop of mayors and elect young next generation leaders in the South, is you have the ability to partner with the private sector and get them to be honest and to get them to change their behavior. And I honestly believe in this environment, particularly accelerated by the events over the summer, there's a real racial reckoning and a real awareness by the private sector that they have to show up differently. Obviously, they're not going to change behavior overnight. As all of my colleagues here on the panel said, this journey is a long-term journey. But I think that the mayors and the elected officials here in the room have a very powerful role to play in holding the private sector accountable while having them be partners. And at the same time, making sure that table that gets convened around these issues includes new voices and next generation leaders, because the future economy is going to be built by the young talent, the young entrepreneurs in many of our communities. And I do see that public-private partnership coming together, accelerated by the events of the summer, but I do think the public sector has a real powerful role to play to keep these conversations honest and authentic. And so I have lots of other lessons from that, but I do think that we can't count that out in this environment, given the nature of the economy being a big part of the public dialogue now.
I think you're right, Amy, and I think now this is the best time to really engage the private sector around racial equity. I mean, how do we move the private sector from marketing to meaning, right? It's really the work. It's really the work that we have to do, and of course.
Can I just say one other thing? The biggest thing, I've been doing so many talks with the private sector. I've been talking to a lot of CEOs. I know Policy Link is part of this conversation too later today, and I know they have been working with Just Capital on this. We all need, there is a lot of corporations right now are trying to figure out what they need to do around racial justice. The one thing I keep saying to them, this is they can't treat this just as charity. As much as philanthropy matters, if they're just writing a check and then walking away, they're abdicating the most important role they play, which is their economic power, and how that economic power gets shared and how economic opportunity is actually given. And that means what they need to do is they need to hire and promote differently. They need to do their own procurement and business development differently. Their products and services need to be done in conjunction with people in the community, because then they're not producing solutions and products that reflect the local population or the future populations. And they need to partner differently in the community. To me, the reason to do it is because it's good for the economic bottom line. And I know that's a big part of the conversation today with everyone, but it is definitely the conversations I'm increasingly in, and there's a readiness for it, Nathaniel. But I think you've been in part of those conversations too. We've got to get past the marketing, the rah-rah conversations that a lot of economic development officials tend to be in, and they need to be really honest about the fact that we're not going to have a strong economy of future competitiveness if we don't embrace diversity and equity in every part of our economic agenda.
Exactly.
And central Black businesses, Black talent, Hispanic business, and Hispanic and immigrant business and talent at the center of economic growth.
Exactly. I mean, in Atlanta, we've now organized over 22 corporations now around the Just Business Roundtable, Atlanta, to begin the process of advancing a racial equity agenda through a corporate lens. It's critical. Christy, I mean, philanthropy has to play a role in moving past the politics of hate and intolerance towards a racial equity agenda. What are your thoughts about that? What role can philanthropy play?
Sure. So, I mean, certainly, when you have political will, that's great. But if not, I think philanthropy has the ability to work with both grassroots and grass tops, right? So we can fund community engagement. We can fund policy advocacy efforts. We can fund, voter engagement and education. We can work with the private sector as well as the government partners. But a lot of times it's helping folks to see what's in it for them, right? So what's the business case for racial equity, right? A lot of folks don't come to this because they're a conscious do-gooder, right? It's like, certainly there definitely are organizations that this is their heart work. But for many, it's proving that the long-term sustainability comes when you prove why this is valuable to you as an organization, why this is valuable to you for the governance of a city, why this is, how this is going to lead to some long-term benefit. And I feel like, matter of fact, the foundation produced a report literally called The Business Case for Racial Equity. And we did it for many of our communities across the country. In 2018, we did one for New Orleans and Louisiana. And I want to pull up just a quick snippet to highlight what the report findings were. It says that the Metro New Orleans area can recognize a $43 billion gain in economic output by 2050 if we can close the racial equity gap. And on top of that, it would mean an additional 5.5 billion a year in new purchasing power. So imagine what that would mean for New Orleans and what it would mean for families and what it would mean for children. And all of this is around addressing closing the racial equity gap. So that ultimately means eliminating disparities and opportunity differentials that limit the potential and economic contributions of people of color. It's not, I mean, everybody wins in this situation, but it's really making the argument that this is not a zero-sum game. It is not you lose something by opening up opportunities for everyone else. And I think that the role that philanthropy plays, like I mentioned, is helping folks to get there. A lot of people have data. We've all been studied to death, right? So it's not that there's not information that highlights what the challenges are in our communities. It's what do you do with that information that is going to make the difference in how it's going to lead to the changes that we want to see in our communities. I can, I know I'm like, got a million examples. I can give an example if you want of where we've seen, some of this work play out. Mm-hmm. But, I just really feel like that if philanthropy can help give the community voice, amplify community voice, and we can fund the efforts that is going to create the groundswell that's going to pressure folks to make the necessary changes. Mm-hmm. That's not only necessary to get to the change, it's necessary to sustain the change. Mm-hmm. Because if we're looking for changes at the government level, you've got to create something that is going to last beyond an administration, right? So, but it's the community that's going to maintain that level of engagement and pressure to make sure that it spans from administration to administration. It becomes the way that our cities and towns operate. So the investment at the community engagement level and building up that local leadership, I think, is one of the critical tools where philanthropy can be useful in building up those skills and knowledge on the ground in order to sustain these efforts.
I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself, Christy. And a lot of times, elected officials, in particular those who want to advance equity, don't understand, from my perspective, how critical it is to support the development of the civic infrastructure of their communities. I mean, we talk a lot about the physical infrastructure of communities, but the civic infrastructure of communities is just as important, especially when you are working to advance a racial equity agenda. Julie, one of the other things that is critical, in my opinion, from my experience in working with elected officials and advancing policy, is courage. Courage is a key ingredient for any elected official who has chosen this path of racial equity. And, even for you, UNUM fellows, you probably know better than I do how risk averse your legal departments can be sometimes. In terms of wanting to move an equity agenda, the developer community sometimes, who may not necessarily be on the same page in terms of understanding how a more inclusive community is not only good for the community, but good for business, right? And then you have a set of community stakeholders that should be a part of the work that you're doing, but may not necessarily understand the value of it. I just wanted you to talk a little bit, Julie, just about that, and I think that work of GARE is just so important, and just, the technical part is great, but holding the hand and supporting the elected official who is trying to be courageous in a political environment where sometimes that is not received in the way that it should. Can you just talk a little bit about that and why courage is important and just the role of GARE in doing that?
Yeah, I also wanted to jump back to what Amy said about reckoning. I think the ability for us to have a reckoning, for us to be able to tell the truth about the history of our country is so critical for us moving forward. That right now we know that across the country, across every, you know, whether we're in major cities, smaller cities, suburban, rural areas, race predicts how well you'll do. Every single indicator for success. And that's not just random, it's not natural. We have inequities because they were intentionally designed. And so for us to understand how we can get to different outcomes, we have to understand the history of what brought us to where we are right now. Now, when government, when the public sector in particular starts to think about racial equity, too frequently what happens is that we tend to think about people and communities of color as if they are problems to be fixed. You see this happening all the time where public sector wants to fund programs, you know, like you look at it in the workforce development world, and we'll talk about people need soft skills. And it's all about sort of fixing people as opposed to fixing the underlying institutions and structures. So for us to be able to have that reckoning, name the history of God that got us to where we are, once we understand that, then it's much easier for us to come up with the solutions that are going to drive us towards change. When it comes to courage, and I love that, I love thinking about that from a perspective of how each person is situated. I was in local government for 25 years, worked across numerous mayors, saw a lot of courage, and I occasionally saw some lack of courage as well. And where I saw things actually, where I saw us getting traction was when people approached, you know, recognition that yes, we need courage, but what we need is collective courage. That this is not work that is to be done by individuals who are, you know, sort of out there being courageous by themselves. It's about us organizing, building a stronger base that too frequently I see people who are just wanting to talk with people who already agree with them. For us to actually move the needle on racial justice, we need to be expanding base. And so thinking about who your existing allies are, who the existing supporters are, how do you actually grow the numbers of people and organizations that are making a true commitment to racial justice? And that's what takes courage, because sometimes that can be a little bit messy. But it's just incredibly important for us to be able to think about organizing in such a way that we're seeing great across the board.
Oh my God. Hello? Okay, sure. So this piece around Julie, are you back? I think you may
Can you
be
hear
back.
me?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Oh.
It's okay. It's okay.
So did I get cut off in the middle
No,
of what I was
no,
saying?
I think you closed it out well. I just didn't know whether you had another thought. But I think this question about courage, right? And collective courage, and this idea of courage being contagious, right? That it has to start with one person, inside of the body politic, inside of government, but being strategic enough to find others, right, who can embrace that vision and be willing to put their political capital on the line. That is really where the opportunities lie, from my perspective. So Amy, like we're in this world now where people are making decisions in spite of the facts, right? They're not. We're not in a time now where the facts are really driving policy making right now. But even with that, I believe that data is even more important in times like that. Even though it may be there may be a need to position it in a different way, right? The utilization of data. Can you talk about that just in terms of, providing some advice, to elected officials around how do you utilize data during a time that is just so divided, right? A time, but at the same time, still pregnant with so much possibility. What are some good ways to utilize data in a time like this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I really believe that the people who are in this program, the people who are doing the hard work in communities, have actually never stopped wanting to rely on good information. I find their national politics and some of our national discourse, and certainly the rise of online platforms and disinformation has really complicated this, particularly for the electorate. And I know at Brookings, we are very mindful of the fact that there are so many different channels now for getting information that it has fractured our country. However, the decision makers, the problem solvers, the doers in communities have never wavered from their commitment to information. I think the issue is, how do you use it to drive change? And so I find a couple things. One is, it's really amazing how even CEOs and civic leaders and government leaders don't have the same understanding about how well their community is doing when it comes to achieving an equitable recovery or inclusive economy. They don't have a sense of who's being most impacted by job loss right now. There's a real desire to place people quickly in jobs. And I say to workforce officials that they are also kind of participating in marginalizing our population, because our data shows that workforce placements predominantly place low-wage workers and workers of color in jobs that are low wage, and perpetuating what is lack of economic mobility because of the mandate to just get people into jobs quickly. And so even workforce system is perpetuating inequality because the way the programs and incentives are set up. And so we have data that shows even to them that they're contributing to the problem. And I can run this all through economic development incentives and how it is contributing inequality or who benefits, in addition to the larger economy as a whole. So I think that people use data to reach a common understanding and to provide insights into solutions. The other thing I'm hearing a lot about is, and I think, Nathaniel, you really wanted to make sure we talk about systemic change. And I'd be curious, Julie's experience with government leaders, and Christy, your work in New Orleans, but I have to tell you, I was on a phone call with the mayor's office, which shall remain nameless, during the collapse of the economy over the summer. And every single city and region had an economic recovery task force of some kind or some plan they were trying to put together. And it all happened right. And then the death and murder of George Floyd, and the outpouring of calls for racial justice. And I wanted to make sure that people were pivoting their plans if they weren't going down an equitable recovery process. And one of the conversations I had with the mayor's office was, we gotta get the jobs back first. We gotta recover the jobs first. Racial justice is harder. It's longer term. We're gonna put that on a separate track. And I went, oh my gosh. And so we put a program together that we released on it's called the Metro Recovery Watch. It's a Rebuild Better plan, but it's trying to tell our elected officials that even during this pandemic, even during this recession, you can right now start to change your policies and your practice that center our Black talent and immigrant talent and equity goals in the middle of the recovery plans. And this is what it looks like in practical terms. And I think that's what's really hard, is most of you as fellows are pragmatists. You want to get something done now. Systemic change sounds hard, but we have to start and put a down payment on it. And sometimes, so just coming back to the metrics, even if we start to change some of our programs and deliveries now, and government is really responsible for that, the long-term game often happens outside of government. And the systems are often transcend government. And so what I've also seen in these recovery plans is using data to set benchmark goals. You know, how do we know that all this CARES money, all these dollars, all these philanthropic funds are actually going to change the structure of opportunity in our community? And how do we use data based on our community to change that progress? And that keeps the eye on the bigger picture, on a collective action, on longer term change. And so I think there is a way where elected officials can both focus on short-term wins while keeping an eye on the long-term goal. And sometimes data and metrics can do that. Final thing I will say, because metrics, I surround myself with this. You know, we were doing some work in Louisville, I'm sorry, in Birmingham, and I know that for one of our fellows is a city council member in Birmingham. Every community right now is talking about supplier diversity. Every corporate leader wants to figure out how to diversify their supply chains or vendor relationships. And they always ask me, how do I get started? What do I do? And the first thing I say is, no one knows what the spend is on private sector procurement. And we need transparency in tracking that data now. So in Birmingham, 10 CEOs just announced a commitment to make their own procurement dollars visible, because only then can you make progress on investments in private sector investments in Black businesses and doing businesses with Black businesses. And the reason why this is important, I'll just close with this, is there's only one study we found that showed what the private sector procurement is when it comes to minority-owned or Black-owned businesses. And it was a 2015 study of Fortune 100 companies, and they actually only like 2/3 of them volunteered their data. And what did they find? Among the top Fortune 100, only 1.5% of private sector spend went to Black-owned businesses. 1.5%. 4.8% went to minority-owned businesses. It is abysmal. You can't set a goal of doubling procurement practices or changing behavior. You don't understand your baseline performance. And that's another reason why data can compel action.
We're about to run out of time.
I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Julie, I wanted you quickly to just provide a good point of departure for some of the fellows. You know, where should they start? And if you could do that briefly, and then I'm going to close it out.
Yeah, I'll do that briefly by picking up on that data question. When it comes to talking about data, there's so many ways in which we can name data from a perspective of what are the disproportionalities, what are the gaps that actually trigger implicit bias and perpetuate stereotypes. And so when we are talking about data, it's really important that we be able to do it from a perspective of systemic racism. Race Forward did a study just this past month looking at the use of the term systemic racism. Systemic racism got used more in June of 2020, maybe 30.
So, yep. So go ahead, Julie. I see you're back on.
I am so sorry. They're using the terminology systemic racism, but aren't actually putting the ideas into action. And that's why operationalizing racial equity, changing policy and practice is so critical.
Thank you. Christy, any final reflections and thoughts that you would like to share from where you sit to just kind of help to close this out for the fellows?
Sure. I think what Amy shared and what Julia shared is spot on, but I also want to just kind of challenge folks to think about systems change a little bit differently. When we think about systems change, it sounds way too big to deal with. Like we've got to blow everything up and start all over. And it's not necessarily that. The example of the Procurement Council and just getting that understanding of where the spend is, it could be just as simple as that. It could be changing a sentence in a policy that makes all the difference in the world, or utilizing your resources that you are in control of differently in a way that will lead to equitable and then longer term systemic change. So think about it as, what is a pain point that we can work on together that if we start here will lead to these other changes? It's not necessarily we have to do everything and just, like, it's not as big as we make it out to be. We can start with a smaller piece that will have ripple effects and start to lead to the types of changes we want to see in our communities.
Thank you so much, Christy. That is just awesome. And I'll just close by saying, the work that you will be doing as UNUM Fellows will be critical, because I deeply believe in my heart, as a leader of the Partnership for Southern Equity, that so goes the South, so goes the nation. And the real change that will happen in our nation will begin and be fortified by the work that is done in the South. And as an organization, we will continue to work regionally to advance a new Southern agenda for racial equity. And with the great panelists and partners that are represented on this panel, along with your leadership and support, we will get there. So let me again thank the panelists so much for your participation. And I'm now going to pass it back off to Amanda.
Thank you, Nathaniel. I want to thank Nathaniel and all of our policy and practice panelists, Amy, Judy, and Christy, for that amazing and rich conversation.